Imagine discovering that the person you trusted most in the world, your own husband, has secretly put a price tag on your life. Tonight, I'm sharing the shocking true story of Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose world shattered when she overheard. A conversation that would change everything. What happened next will leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of the small cottage in Millbrook, Oregon, as Elena Rodriguez folded the last of her husband's work shirts, 28 years old, with gentle brown eyes and calloused hands from years of cleaning houses. She had always believed that love meant sacrifice. For 3 years of marriage to Marcus Rodriguez, sacrifice had been her daily routine. Marcus worked construction when jobs were available, which wasn't often in their economically struggling town. Elena supplemented their income by cleaning homes. For the wealthy families on Hillcrest Avenue, scrubbing floors and washing dishes for people who barely acknowledged her existence. Every evening, she would return home exhausted, her back aching, her spirit worn thin. But she told herself this was temporary. Marcus would find steady work soon. Things would get better. The cottage they rented was barely 800 square feet, with peeling wallpaper and a leaky roof that Marcus kept promising to fix. Elena had tried to make it feel like home, arranging wildflowers in mason jars and hanging second-hand curtains she'd sewn herself. But lately, the walls seemed to close in on her, especially when Marcus returned from his nights at Flanagan's Tavern, reeking of whiskey and disappointment. On this particular Thursday evening in November, Elena was preparing dinner when she heard Marcus's truck rumble into their gravel driveway earlier than usual. Through the kitchen window, she watched him stumble slightly as he made his way to the front door, and her heart sank. Another day, another failure to find work, another night of him drowning his frustrations in alcohol. "Elena!" Marcus called. As he entered, his voice carrying that familiar edge that made her shoulders tense. "Where's my dinner?" "Almost ready," she replied softly, stirring the pot of beans and rice. Again. It was one of the few meals they could afford to make regularly. "How was your day?" Marcus slumped into his chair at their small kitchen table, running his hands through his dark hair. At 32, he still had the broad shoulders that had attracted Elena when they first met at a church social, but his face had grown harder over the years, lines etching around his eyes that spoke of bitter disappointment rather than laughter. "Same. As always," he muttered. "Johnson's crew is full. Martinez doesn't need anyone this week. This whole damn town is dying, Elena. There's nothing here for people like us." Elena served him his dinner in silence, having learned that words of comfort often only made his mood worse. She sat across from him with her own small portion, watching as he ate mechanically, his jaw working with the same rhythm as his frustration. "I've been thinking," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes not meeting hers. "Maybe it's time we considered other options." "What kind of options?" Elena asked, though something in his tone made her stomach flutter with unease. "Leave Millbrook. Go somewhere. With more opportunities. California, maybe. Or Texas." He took a long drink from his beer bottle. "But we'd need money to start over. Real money." Eleanor nodded slowly. They had discussed this before, but their savings account held barely $300. "I could ask Mrs. Patterson if she needs more help. Maybe I could clean her house twice a week instead of once." Marcus's fork clattered against his plate. "Mrs. Patterson," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want to scrub that woman's toilets twice a week so we can save an extra $40 a month? Elena, at that rate, we'll be stuck in this hellhole until we're 60. The conversation ended there, as it always did, with Marcus finishing his dinner in brooding silence while Elena cleared the dishes. Later that evening, she heard him making phone calls from their bedroom, his voice low and urgent. When she passed by the door, she caught fragments of conversation, mentions of money, of opportunities, of making it work. She assumed he was calling about job prospects and felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Marcus was unusually cheerful. He kissed Eleanor's forehead before she left for work, something he hadn't done in months, and told her he might have good news soon. Elena spent her day at the Hendricks mansion, scrubbing marble floors and polishing silver, allowing herself to imagine that maybe things were finally turning around for them. But it was the following Tuesday when Elena's world began to unravel. She had finished her work at the Morrison house early and decided to surprise Marcus by picking up groceries for a special dinner. As she approached their cottage, she noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked outside. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices, Marcus's voice, and two others she didn't recognize. Elena quietly entered through the back door, her heart racing with curiosity and a growing sense of dread. The voices were coming from their living room, and she crept closer, staying hidden behind the kitchen doorway. "So we're clear on the terms," a man's gravelly voice was saying. "The auction is Saturday night, cash only, no questions asked afterward. And you guarantee she won't be harmed," Marcus's voice, strained and nervous. "Look, Rodriguez, that's not our concern. Once the transaction is complete, what happens after is between the buyer and the merchandise. Our job is just to facilitate the sale." Elena's knees nearly buckled. Merchandise, sale. The words crashed over her like ice water. A second voice, smoother than the first, continued. "Your wife is young, attractive, healthy. Based on the photos you provided, we estimate she'll fetch between 15 and 20,000, maybe more if there's competitive bidding." 20,000, Marcus repeated, and Eleanor could hear the hunger in his voice. That would be enough to start over somewhere new. "More than enough," the gravelly voice agreed. "Now about the logistics. Saturday night you'll need to bring her to the warehouse on Dock Street. Tell her you're going to dinner or something. We'll handle the rest." "And afterward?" Marcus asked. "Afterward, you collect your money and disappear. New life, new city. Whatever you want. Just make sure you're not around when people start asking questions about where your wife went." Elena pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her own husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her, was planning to sell her like livestock. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain she had ever experienced. "I need to know she'll be treated well," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounded more like he was trying to ease his own conscience than protect his wife. "She'll be treated exactly as well as her new owner wants to treat her," the smooth voice replied. "That's how this works, Rodriguez. You don't get to dictate terms after you've taken the money." Elena heard footsteps moving toward the front door and quickly retreated to the back of the house, her mind reeling. Saturday night, 3 days away. 3 days to figure out how to escape the trap her own husband had set for her. As the car pulled away, Elena forced herself to act normal when Marcus came looking for her. She pretended to be putting away groceries, chatting about her day while her insides churned with terror and heartbreak. Marcus seemed nervous but excited, talking about their future with an enthusiasm she hadn't seen in years. "I think our luck is about to change, Elena," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stood at the sink. "I can feel it. Big changes are coming." Elena nodded and smiled, playing the role of the trusting wife while her mind raced through possible escape plans. She had no family nearby, no close friends she could turn to, and barely enough money for a bus ticket out of town. Worse, she realized that even if she ran, Marcus knew where she worked, knew her routines. He could track her down easily. That night, as Marcus slept beside her, Elena stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of how her life had come to this moment. She thought about the girl she had been at 25, full of hope and dreams, believing that marriage to Marcus would be the beginning of a beautiful life together. She remembered their wedding day, dancing to their song while her mother wiped away tears of joy. How had that hopeful young woman become merchandise in her own husband's eyes? The next morning, Elena went through the motions of her regular routine, but everything felt different. Marcus's kiss goodbye felt like a betrayal. His casual "see you tonight" felt like a lie. Even their cottage, with all its imperfections, suddenly felt like a prison where she was being held until her auction date arrived. At the Hendricks house, Eleanor found herself studying the family photos on the mantelpiece. Images of a husband and wife who seemed genuinely happy together, children who had never known the fear of being sold by someone who claimed to love them. Mrs. Hendricks was demanding and often rude, but Elena envied her security, her certainty that she would sleep in her own bed every night. "Elena, what's wrong with you today?" Mrs. Hendricks snapped from her perch on the living room sofa. "You've been staring at that same photograph for 5 minutes. I don't pay you to daydream." "Sorry, ma'am," Elena murmured, returning to her dusting with mechanical precision. But her mind continued to race. Saturday was approaching fast, and she still had no clear plan for escape. Even worse, she realized that part of her was paralyzed. Not just by fear, but by a devastating sense of worthlessness. If her own husband could see her as nothing more than an object to be sold, what value did she really have? Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe $20,000 was more than she was worth as a person. The thought terrified her more than anything. Else that she might be starting to believe what Marcus apparently already believed about her. As Thursday evening approached, Eleanor returned home to find Marcus in an unusually good mood. He had even attempted to clean the kitchen, though his efforts were clumsy and half-hearted. He greeted her with a smile that once would have warmed her heart, but now filled her with dread. "How about we go out for dinner Saturday night?" he suggested. "Casually. That new place on Dock Street. We could use a night out, don't you think?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena's blood turned to ice. Dock Street, the warehouse where her auction was planned. Marcus was already setting the trap, speaking to her as if he cared about her happiness while planning her destruction. "That sounds nice," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. As Marcus smiled and talked about their Saturday evening plans, Elena realized with crystal clarity that she was completely alone in the world. The man she had trusted with her life was about to hand her over to strangers for money. In less than 48 hours, she would either find a way to save herself or she would disappear forever. The rain continued to fall against their cottage windows, and Elena listened to it while Marcus talked, wondering if these might be among the last sounds of freedom she would ever hear. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Elena woke before dawn, her body trembling from a sleepless night filled with nightmares about warehouses and strangers with hungry eyes. Marcus slept peacefully beside her, one arm thrown across her waist in what once felt like protection, but now felt like ownership. She carefully slipped from beneath his arm and padded to the bathroom, where she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman looking back at her had Elena's face, but something fundamental had changed. Her eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there a week ago, a steely determination born from desperation. She was no longer the passive woman who accepted whatever life handed her. Tomorrow night, she would either save herself or die trying. Elena dressed quietly and left for work without waking Marcus. As she walked through the empty streets of Millbrook, she formulated the beginnings of a plan. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, but it was the only option she could see. At the Morrison house, Eleanor found herself studying the family's security system, a sophisticated setup with cameras and motion sensors that connected directly to the police station. Mrs. Morrison had mentioned it proudly during Elena's first week, explaining how it made her feel safe when her husband traveled for business. Elena filed this information away, though she wasn't sure yet how it might help her. "Elena, I need you to clean the guest room thoroughly today," Mrs. Morrison announced over her morning coffee. "My sister is visiting from Portland this weekend, and you know how particular she is." Elena nodded and began her work, but her mind was elsewhere. Portland, a city large enough to disappear in, far enough from Millbrook that Marcus might not think to look for her there. But she would need money for a bus ticket, and she had barely $30 in her purse. As she cleaned the guest room, Eleanor noticed Mrs. Morrison's jewelry box sitting open on the dresser. Inside, she could see several pieces of expensive jewelry. Rings, necklaces, earrings that probably cost more than Elena earned in a year. For a moment, the thought crossed her mind to take something, just enough to buy her freedom. But even in her desperation, Elena couldn't bring herself to steal from the people who trusted her in their homes. Instead, she focused on her work and tried to think of legal ways to raise money quickly. She could sell her few possessions, but they weren't worth much. She could ask for an advance on her wages, but that would require explaining why she needed money urgently, and she couldn't risk word getting back to Marcus. The day passed in a blur of cleaning and planning. Elena found herself memorizing details about the Morrison house, the location of the back door key, the timing of the security system's nightly activation, the fact that the family often left for weekend trips without warning. Information that might be useful if she needed a place to hide. When evening came, Eleanor returned home to find Marcus pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. He glanced up when she entered, his eyes bright with nervous energy. "Yeah. She just walked in," he said into the phone. "Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock sharp, she'll be there." He ended the call and turned to Elena with a smile that made her skin crawl. "How was your day, sweetheart?" "Fine," Elena replied, setting down her purse and moving toward the kitchen. "Who were you talking to?" "Just confirming our dinner reservation for tomorrow night," Marcus lied smoothly. "I want everything to be perfect." Elena nodded and began preparing dinner, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. She had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save herself, and Marcus was already finalizing the details of her sale. As they ate dinner, Marcus talked excitedly about their future plans. He had it all figured out. They would move to Austin, Texas, where he had a friend who could help him get into the construction business. They would rent a nice apartment, maybe even buy a house eventually. Elena listened to his fantasies while knowing that they would never see Austin together. By Sunday morning, she would either be free or dead, and Marcus would be $20,000 richer. "You seemed quiet tonight," Marcus observed, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Are you excited about tomorrow?" Elena forced a smile. "Just tired. It's been a long week." "Well, after tomorrow night, everything changes," Marcus said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "You'll see. All our problems will be solved." That night, Elena lay awake, listening to Marcus's breathing, waiting for him to fall into deep sleep. When she was certain he wouldn't wake, she slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, where she quietly gathered supplies: a small knife from the drawer, matches from beside the stove, the emergency flashlight from the junk drawer. She hid these items in her purse, along with what little money she had. She also wrote a letter, though she wasn't sure who would ever read it. In it, she explained what Marcus had planned, named the men who had visited their house, and described the warehouse on Dock Street. If something happened to her, if she didn't survive the next day, maybe the letter would help police understand what had occurred. Saturday dawned grey and cold, with a sharp wind that rattled the windows and sent leaves skittering across the roads. Elena went through her morning routine mechanically, but every small action felt significant. Possibly the last time she would brush her teeth in this bathroom, the last time she would drink coffee from this chipped mug, the last time she would see this cottage that had been her prison and her sanctuary. Marcus was unusually attentive, bringing her coffee in bed and talking about the special dinner they would have that evening. His kindness felt like acid on her skin, knowing it was all part of the elaborate deception he had constructed. "I need to run some errands today," Marcus announced after breakfast. "Last-minute preparations for tonight." Elena nodded, relieved to have him out of the house. The moment his truck disappeared down the street, she sprang into action. She packed a small bag with her few valuable possessions, her mother's ring, some photographs, a change of clothes. She hid the bag under the loose floorboard in their bedroom, where Marcus would never think to look. Then she called Mrs. Morrison. "Elena, what are you calling on a Saturday?" Mrs. Morrison's voice was sharp with annoyance. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mom, but I wanted to ask about extra work. I could come in today if you need anything cleaned before your sister arrives." There was a pause. "Actually, that's perfect timing. I could use help preparing the house. Can you be here in an hour?" Elena confirmed and hung up, her heart racing. She had just bought herself several hours away from the cottage, away from Marcus's watchful eyes. More importantly, she had positioned herself at the Morrison house, where she might be able to implement the desperate plan that had been forming in her mind. At the Morrison house, Eleanor worked with fierce concentration, cleaning every surface, until it gleamed while her mind ran through the details of her escape plan. The house would be empty by evening. Mrs. Morrison had mentioned that the family was attending a wedding in the next town and wouldn't return until late Sunday. The security system would be active, but Elena had watched Mrs. Morrison disarm it dozens of times and knew the code. As evening approached, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Heading home soon. Can't wait for our special dinner tonight. Love you." Elena stared at the message, feeling nauseated by the casual cruelty of it. Marcus could text "love you" while planning to sell her to strangers. The depth of his betrayal was breathtaking. She finished her work at the Morrison house and returned home, where she found Marcus in their bedroom, getting dressed in his best shirt and pants. He had even put on cologne, as if he were preparing for a legitimate date, rather than a human trafficking transaction. "You look beautiful," he said, when Elena emerged from the bathroom in her only good dress. The compliment felt like a knife in her chest. They drove to Dock Street in Marcus's truck, the radio playing softly while Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She studied the route carefully, memorizing landmarks and calculating distances. The warehouse district was on the opposite side of town from the Morrison house, but she could cover that distance on foot if necessary. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was a small place called Tony's Diner, dimly lit and nearly empty. Elena realized he had selected it because it was close to the warehouse, where her auction would take place. Every detail had been planned. As they ate dinner, Marcus kept checking his watch. Elena picked at her food, her stomach too twisted with anxiety to manage more than a few bites. She was hyper-aware of everything. The way the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, the sound of cars passing on the street outside, the weight of the small knife in her purse. "Eleanor," Marcus said suddenly, his voice softer than it had been in months, "I want you to know that everything I've done for us, for our future." Elena looked up from her untouched meal to meet his eyes. "What do you mean?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Sometimes a man has to make difficult choices, hard choices. But if it means we can finally have the life we deserve, then it's worth it." The words were so close to a confession that Elena's breath caught in her throat. Even now, facing what he was about to do to her, Marcus was trying to justify it in terms of their relationship. He had convinced himself that selling his wife was somehow an act of love. "I don't understand," Elena said quietly. "You will," Marcus replied, glancing at his watch again. "Soon everything will make sense." At 7:30, Marcus paid the check and they walked back to his truck. Elena's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had one chance to escape, and it would come in the next few minutes. "Actually," Marcus said as they reached the truck, "there's something I want to show you first. A surprise." He guided her away from the restaurant toward a cluster of warehouses a few blocks away. Elena's heart rate spiked as she recognized the area from her earlier reconnaissance. This was it. The moment when Marcus would deliver her to the men who had bought her. The warehouse Marcus led her to was nondescript, with a single metal door and no windows. Light seeped from beneath the door, and Elena could hear voices inside. Multiple men talking in low tones. Her auction was about to begin. Marcus knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 3 quick taps, then 2 slower ones. The door opened. To reveal a man Elena recognized from Tuesday's conversation, the one with the gravelly voice. He was older than she had expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her like she was livestock. "Right on time," the man said, stepping aside to let them enter. "She's even prettier than the photos." Elena stepped inside and immediately understood the full horror of her situation. The warehouse had been set up like a grotesque auction house. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a raised platform, and at least 15 men sat in those chairs, studying her with predatory interest. Some were young, some old, but all had the same hungry expression that made Elena's skin crawl. "Gentlemen," the silver-haired man announced, "our final lot of the evening has arrived." Elena turned to Marcus, her eyes wide with betrayal and terror. "Marcus, what is this?" But Marcus wouldn't meet her gaze. He was staring at the floor, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Elena," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The silver-haired man placed a firm hand on Elena's shoulder. "Don't make this difficult, sweetheart. The sooner we get started, the sooner everyone can go home happy." Elena's mind went completely blank with panic. This was real. This was actually happening. In a few minutes she would be sold to one of these men, and Marcus would walk away with his money while she disappeared forever. But as the terror reached its peak, something else surfaced in Elena's mind, a cold, clear fury that cut through the fear like a blade. She had spent 3 years allowing Marcus to diminish her, to make her feel worthless and dependent. She had cleaned houses for people who barely saw her as human. She had accepted a life of servitude and invisibility. Not anymore. Elena's hand moved slowly toward her purse, her fingers finding the handle of the small knife she had hidden there. She wasn't going to die in this warehouse. She wasn't going to be sold like cattle. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. The silver-haired man was guiding her toward the platform when Elena made her move. She spun around, pulling the knife from her purse and slashing at the man's arm in one fluid motion. He screamed and stumbled backward, blood spurting from the wound. "She's got a knife!" someone shouted, and suddenly the warehouse erupted in chaos. Elena ran toward the door, but 2 men moved to block her path. She slashed at them wildly, the knife cutting through the air as she fought with desperate fury. Behind her she could hear Marcus calling her name, but she didn't turn around. She would never turn around for him again. One of the men lunged at her, and Elena drove the knife into his shoulder, twisting it as hard as she could. He screamed and fell to his knees, and Elena pushed past him toward the door. Her hand closed on the handle just as someone grabbed her from behind. "Let me go!" Elena screamed, thrashing against the arms that held her. "Let me go!" But there were too many of them, and Elena was only one woman with a small knife. Strong hands wrenched the weapon from her grip, and she felt herself being dragged back toward the platform. The men were angry now, their faces twisted with rage at her defiance. "Feisty little thing," one of them said, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "That's going to cost extra." Elena continued to struggle, but she knew it was hopeless. Her moment of rebellion had failed, and now she would pay the price for her defiance. The silver-haired man, still clutching his bleeding arm, was giving orders to restrain her more securely. That's when they heard the sirens. At first it was just a distant wail in the night, but it grew louder and closer with each passing second. The men in the warehouse looked at each other with a growing alarm. "Police!" someone hissed. "How did they know?" Elena's heart leaped with sudden hope. Somehow, impossibly, help was coming. But who had called the police? How had they known where? To find her? The sirens were right outside now, and suddenly the warehouse door burst open. Police officers in tactical gear flooded into the space, shouting orders and pointing weapons. In the chaos that followed, Elena found herself pushed to the ground, her hands zip-tied behind her back, along with everyone else, while the officers secured the scene. "We've got the victim," she heard one officer say into his radio. "Female, appears unharmed but shaken, requesting medical attention to the scene." Elena looked around wildly for Marcus, but he had vanished in the confusion. Several of the men from the auction were being led away in handcuffs, but her husband was nowhere to be seen. He had abandoned her even in this moment, saving himself while leaving her to face the consequences of his actions. As the police untied her hands and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, Elena finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "How did you know? How did you find me?" The officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled gently. "Anonymous tip came in about 2 hours ago. Someone called and said there was going to be a human trafficking operation at this address tonight. Gave us detailed information about the time and the participants." Elena's mind reeled. An anonymous tip? Who could have known about the auction besides Marcus and the traffickers themselves? None of them would have called the police. "Did the caller identify themselves?" Elena asked. The officer shook her head. "No, but it was definitely a man. He seemed to know exactly what was going on here, said he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to stop it." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of fear or despair. Someone had saved her. Someone had cared enough about her life to risk everything to call for help. As the police led her away from the warehouse, Elena turned back one last time to look at the building where she had almost been sold. She was free, but she was also alone in a way she had never been before. Marcus was gone, probably fled to another state by now. Her marriage, her home, her entire life in Millbrook was over, but she was alive, she was free, and for the first time in years, she belonged to no one but herself. The question that haunted her as the police car pulled away was simple. Who had made that anonymous call? Who had saved her life, and why? The answer to that question would change everything Elena thought she knew about kindness, about strangers, and about the unexpected ways that salvation can arrive when all hope seems lost. The police station in Millbrook had never seen a case like this. Detective Sarah Chen sat across from Elena in a small interview room, a steaming cup of coffee between them and a digital recorder capturing every word. Elena had been at the station for 3 hours, giving her statement over and over, but one question remained unanswered. Who had called in the tip that saved her life? "Mrs. Rodriguez," Detective Chen said gently, "I need you to think carefully. Is there anyone at all, who might have known about your husband's plans? A neighbor who might have overheard something? A friend Marcus might have confided in?" Elena shook her head for the 10th time. "Marcus doesn't have friends. Just drinking buddies at Flanagan's Tavern, and he would never tell them about something like this. He was too ashamed." She paused, the irony of that statement hitting her. Ashamed enough to hide it, but not ashamed enough to stop. "Detective," Chen made a note, "what about at your work? Could someone there have noticed something unusual about your behavior? Maybe picked up on the fact that you were in danger? Elena considered this. Over the past week, she had been distracted and nervous while cleaning the various houses on her route. But the wealthy families she worked for barely acknowledged her existence. Mrs. Patterson treated her like a piece of furniture. The Hendricks family rarely spoke to her beyond giving orders. Mrs. Morrison was polite but distant. "I don't think so," Eleanor said slowly. "The people I work for, they don't really see me. I'm just the cleaning lady." But even as she said it, Eleanor felt a nagging sensation that she was missing something important. Someone had cared enough to save her life. Someone had known exactly when and where the auction would take place. Someone had risked exposure to make that anonymous phone call. Detective Chen leaned forward. "Elena, I'm going to play you the recording of the anonymous tip. Maybe hearing the voice will help you identify who called." She pressed a button on a small device, and suddenly a man's voice filled the room. It was muffled, as if the caller was deliberately trying to disguise his voice. But Elena could make out the words clearly. "There's going to be a human trafficking operation tonight at the warehouse on Dock Street. 8 o'clock. They're planning to auction a woman, Elena Rodriguez from Millbrook. Her husband set it up. You need to get there before they hurt her." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't Marcus. She would have recognized her husband's voice instantly, even disguised. It wasn't any of the men from the warehouse either. This voice had a warmth to it, a genuine concern that made her chest tighten with emotion. "Play it again," she whispered. Detective Chen obliged, and Elena closed her eyes, concentrating on every inflection, every subtle accent. There was something about the way the caller pronounced certain words, a slight formality in his speech pattern that reminded her of... "Oh my God," Elena breathed, her eyes flying open. "I think I know who it is." 3 hours later, Elena stood on the doorstep of the Morrison mansion, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The house was dark except for a single light in what she knew was the home office. Through the window, she could see a figure, hunched over a desk, working late into the night. Elena rang the doorbell and waited, her hands trembling slightly. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened to reveal James Morrison, dressed in a casual sweater and jeans instead of his usual business attire. He was a man in his mid-40s with graying temples and intelligent brown eyes that widened. In surprise when he saw her, "Elena, what are you doing here? It's nearly midnight," and he stopped mid-sentence, taking in her appearance. The clothes she had been wearing to dinner, the stress etched on her face, the way she was looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "You called the police," Elena said quietly. It wasn't a question. James Morrison stood frozen in his doorway for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, and he stepped aside to let her in. "How did you know?" he asked as they walked into his living room. "Your voice," Eleanor replied. "I've heard you on the phone with business associates hundreds of times while I was cleaning. You have a very distinctive way of speaking, especially when you're trying to be formal or official." James gestured for her to sit on the leather sofa, then took the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied this man who had saved her life. Really studied him for perhaps the first time in the 2 years she had been cleaning his house. James Morrison was wealthy, successful and respected in Millbrook. He owned 3 businesses in town and served on the city council. Elena had always seen him as just another employer, polite but distant, existing in a world completely separate from hers. She had never imagined that he even noticed her beyond her function as the woman who kept his house clean. "How did you know?" Elena asked finally. "How did you know what Marcus was planning?" James ran a hand through his greying hair and sighed deeply. I didn't, not at first, but I knew something was wrong. You've been cleaning our house for 2 years, Elena, and I pay attention to people. I notice things. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. 3 weeks ago, you started acting differently. You were jumpy, distracted. You would flinch when the phone rang or when someone came to the door unexpectedly. My wife didn't notice, but I did. Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen her fear and cared enough to pay attention. Then last Tuesday, James continued, I came home early from a business trip. I was in my office with the door closed when you arrived to clean. You probably didn't know I was there. Eleanor's heart began to race. Tuesday, the day she had overheard Marcus's conversation with the traffickers. I heard you on your phone in the kitchen, James said, turning back to face her. You were crying, talking to someone. I think it was your sister in California, telling her that you were scared, that Marcus was planning something terrible, but you couldn't prove it. You said you thought he was going to hurt you, but you didn't know how or when. Elena remembered that phone call. She had been desperate for someone to talk to, someone who might believe her if something happened. Her sister had been sympathetic, but ultimately helpless, too far away to do anything concrete. I almost came out and asked you what was wrong, James continued. But then you hung up quickly and went back to cleaning like nothing had happened. I thought maybe I had misunderstood, or maybe it was just a marital spat that would blow over. He sat back down, leaning forward with his hands clasped. But then yesterday, I saw your husband. You saw Marcus? Elena asked, surprised. He was at Thompson's pawn shop downtown trying to sell your wedding ring, James said quietly. I recognized it because you always twist it when you're nervous. It's a habit I've noticed. The pawn shop owner is a friend of mine, and he called me about it because he thought it was suspicious. A man selling his wife's wedding ring while she's presumably still married to him. Eleanor's hand moved automatically to her left ring finger, and she realized with a shock that her wedding ring was indeed missing. Marcus must have taken it while she slept, adding insult to injury by selling the symbol of their marriage to fund his new life. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong, James said. So I started paying closer attention. I noticed Marcus driving by the house several times this week, always slowing down when he passed, like he was watching you work. Yesterday I decided to follow him. Elena felt her breath catch. You followed him? James nodded grimly. He went to a bar called Flanagan's Tavern and met with 2 men I didn't recognize. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see them through the window. They were showing Marcus photographs. I realized later they were probably pictures of you. Money changed hands. It was clearly some kind of transaction. The pieces were falling into place now. James had witnessed Marcus finalizing the arrangements for her sale, though he hadn't understood what he was seeing at the time. I still didn't know exactly what was happening, James continued, but I knew it involved you and that you were in danger. So I did something I've never done before. I hired a private investigator. Elena's eyes widened. You hired an investigator? His name is David Reeves. He's an ex-cop who specializes in domestic cases. I told him everything I had observed and asked him to find out what your husband was planning. James's voice grew heavy with emotion. What he discovered was worse than anything I had imagined. James reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, handing it to Eleanor. David has contacts in law enforcement. He was able to trace the 2 men Marcus had met with. They're part of a human trafficking ring that operates throughout the Pacific Northwest. They specialize in what they call domestic acquisitions. Husbands selling their wives, fathers selling their daughters. Elena felt nauseated. How many women have they? Too many, James said quietly. David learned that they had scheduled an auction for tonight, and that you were going to be the featured lot. That's when I called the police. They sat in silence. For a moment, the weight of what had almost happened settling over them both. Eleanor tried to process the extraordinary chain of events that had led to her rescue. A wealthy businessman who had noticed her distress, paid attention to subtle changes in her behavior, and ultimately spent his own money to investigate and save her life. "Why?" Eleanor asked finally. "Why did you care so much? I'm just your cleaning lady. We barely know each other." James looked at her with an expression of profound sadness. "Eleanor, do you really think so little of yourself? You've been in my house twice a week for 2 years. I've watched you work with such care and dignity, even when my wife treats you poorly. I've seen you water the plants you thought were dying, fix things that were broken without being asked, leave little notes when you found something that needed my attention." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But more than that, I've seen the bruises." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her wrist, where finger-shaped marks had faded but not completely disappeared. "I've seen the way you flinch when men raise their voices," James continued. "I've seen you make yourself smaller whenever your husband calls during work hours. I've watched a vibrant, intelligent woman slowly dim over the past 2 years, and I knew someone was hurting you." Tears were streaming down Elena's face now. "But you never said anything." "I didn't know how," James admitted. "I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know how to approach you about it. You seem so private, so determined to handle everything yourself. I was afraid that if I interfered, I might make things worse for you." He leaned forward, his voice intensifying with emotion. "But when I realized that your life was in immediate danger, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you that I might have prevented." Eleanor wiped her eyes, trying to process this revelation. All this time she had felt invisible, worthless, forgotten by the world. But James Morrison had been watching over her, noticing details about her life that even her own husband had ignored. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Marcus is gone. I have no money, no home, no job." The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was free, but she was also completely alone and destitute. James smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "Actually, you do have a job, if you want it." Elena looked at him questioningly. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," James said. "My wife and I are getting divorced. It's been a long time coming, and it's going to be finalized next month. She's moving to Seattle to be closer to her sister." Elena knew that Mrs. Morrison had been cold and distant lately, but she hadn't realized the marriage was ending. "I'm going to need help managing the house on my own," James continued. "Not just cleaning, but organization, scheduling, maybe some light cooking. It would be a full-time position with a real salary, health insurance, and living quarters in the apartment above the garage if you're interested." Elena stared at him in shock. "You're offering me a job? A place to live?" "I'm offering you a fresh start," James said gently. "A chance to rebuild your life on your own terms, without anyone controlling you or making you feel worthless." The offer was so generous, so unexpected, that Elena could barely speak. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." James stood up and walked to his desk, returning with a check that he handed to Elena. She looked down at it and gasped. It was made out for $5,000. "Consider it back to pay for all the extra work you've done over the years without being compensated," James said, "and a sign of good faith for the future." Elena stared at the check, overwhelmed by the kindness of this man who had saved her life and was now offering her a future. "Why are you doing this? Why are you being so kind to me?" James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft with memory. 20 years ago, I was married to someone else. My first wife, Catherine. She was beautiful, kind, intelligent. Everything I thought I wanted in a partner." He walked back to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "But Catherine had a secret. Her first husband had been abusive, and even though she had divorced him, she lived in constant fear. She never told me the full extent of what she had endured, but I could see the signs, the same signs I've seen in you. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sympathy. One night, Catherine's ex-husband broke into our house, James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been drinking, and he was angry about the divorce settlement. I was working late at the office, and Catherine was home alone. Elena could sense the tragedy coming, and she felt tears beginning to flow again. By the time I got home, it was too late, James said simply. Catherine died because I wasn't there to protect her, because I had failed to recognize how serious the danger was. He turned back to Eleanor, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I swore that night that I would never again stand by and watch someone suffer in silence. I would never again fail to act when I saw someone in danger. Eleanor stood up and walked to James, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "When I saw what was happening to you," James said, "I saw Catherine all over again, another woman trapped, afraid, isolated. But this time, I had a chance to do something about it. This time, I could save someone." They stood together in the quiet room, two people who had found each other across the vast divide that usually separates the wealthy from the working class, the powerful from the powerless. Elena realized that James had not just saved her life, he had restored her faith in human kindness. "I accept your offer," Elena said firmly. "The job, the apartment, all of it. And I promise you that I will never let anyone make me feel worthless." Again, James smiled, and for the first time in years, Elena felt truly safe. She was no longer the woman who could be sold at auction, no longer the invisible cleaning lady, no longer Marcus Rodriguez's property. She was Elena Rodriguez, survivor, and she belonged to no one but herself. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the sky, marking the beginning of Elena's new life. In a few hours, the police would arrest Marcus at a motel outside of Portland, where he had been hiding with his pockets full of blood money that would now be evidence in his trafficking trial. But Elena didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she was alive, she was free, and she had found an unexpected guardian angel in the most unlikely place. The nightmare was over. The real journey was just beginning. 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, Elena stood in the courthouse lobby wearing a navy blue dress that James had helped her pick out for the occasion. Today was Marcus's arraignment, and despite her lawyer's assurance that she wouldn't have to testify until the actual trial, Elena felt compelled to see her former husband face the charges against him. The apartment above James's garage had become Elena's sanctuary during these difficult weeks. It was small but beautifully appointed, with large windows that let in streams of morning sunlight and a kitchenette where she had rediscovered her love of cooking. For the first time in years, Eleanor woke up each morning without fear, without wondering what mood Marcus would be in or whether she had done something to displease him. "You don't have to go in there," Detective Chen said, approaching Elena in the lobby. "The arraignment is mostly procedural. We have enough evidence to proceed without putting you through this." Elena shook her head. "I need to see him. I need to look him in the eye and know that he can't hurt me anymore." Detective Chen nodded understandingly. Over the past 3 weeks, she had become more than just the investigating officer. She had become Elena's advocate, and, surprisingly, her friend. "Just remember, he's going to try to manipulate you. Men like Marcus are experts at making their victims feel guilty or responsible for what happened." Elena straightened her shoulders. "I'm not his victim anymore." They entered the courtroom together, and Elena took a seat in the gallery. The room was nearly empty, except for a few reporters, court officials, and a woman Elena didn't recognize, sitting in the front row. When Marcus was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, Elena felt her heart skip, but not from fear, from anger. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished somehow. His face was pale and stubbled, his hair unwashed. When his eyes found her in the gallery, she saw him flinch as if she had struck him. Good, Elena thought. Let him feel uncomfortable for once. The proceedings were swift and formal. Marcus's court appointed. Attorney entered a plea of not guilty to charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. The prosecutor outlined the state's case in broad strokes. The recorded phone conversations with the traffickers, the money Marcus had received as a down payment, the testimony of the undercover officer who had infiltrated the auction. What surprised Elena was how clinical it all sounded. The prosecutor spoke about the defendant and the intended victim, as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than the destruction of a marriage and the near destruction of a life. When the hearing concluded, Marcus was led away. Without looking back at Elena, she felt a strange sense of closure watching him disappear through the door that led back to his holding cell. This man who had once controlled every aspect of her life was now powerless, dependent on court-appointed lawyers and county jail meals. As Elena gathered her purse to leave, the woman from the front row approached her. She was middle-aged, with silver-streaked brown hair and kind eyes that reminded Elena of her own mother. "Excuse me," the woman said gently. "Are you Elena Rodriguez?" Elena nodded cautiously. "My name is Patricia Wells. I'm Marcus's mother." Elena felt her breath catch. She had met Patricia only twice during her marriage to Marcus. Brief, awkward encounters where Marcus's mother had been polite but distant. Elena had always sensed that Patricia disapproved of their marriage, though she had never understood. "Why, Mrs. Wells?" Elena said carefully. "I'm surprised to see you here." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I came to apologize to you and to tell you something I should have told you years ago." They walked outside the courthouse together, finding a quiet bench in the small park across the street. Patricia sat down heavily, as if the weight of what she was carrying was physically exhausting. "Elena, I need you to know what my son did to you. It wasn't the first time." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Patricia took a shaky breath. "Marcus was married before you. Her name was Jennifer Walsh. They were married for 2 years and—" She paused, gathering her courage. "Marcus sold her, too." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. "He sold his first wife to a man in Nevada who ran what he called a domestic service company," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. "Jennifer disappeared one night, and Marcus told everyone she had run off with another man. But I knew better. I had seen the bruises, heard the arguments. I knew Marcus was capable of terrible things." Elena felt nauseated. "Why didn't you report? Why didn't you warn me?" Patricia began to cry openly now. "Because I was a coward, because Marcus is my son, and despite everything he's done, I couldn't bring myself to believe he would do it again. I told myself that Jennifer's situation was different, that maybe she really had run away." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, handing it to Elena. It showed a young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile standing next to a younger version of Marcus at what appeared to be their wedding. Jennifer was 24. "When she disappeared," Patricia continued, "she was an elementary school teacher, kind and gentle, just like you. She loved children and wanted to start a family with Marcus." Elena stared at the photograph, seeing her own story reflected in Jennifer's face. "What happened to her? Do you know if she's still alive?" Patricia shook her head. "I hired a private investigator 2 years ago, after my conscience finally got the better of me. He traced her to Nevada, but the trail went cold there. The man who bought her moved frequently, and Jennifer's legal identity was essentially erased. The full horror of what Marcus had done was beginning to sink in. Elena wasn't his first victim. She was part of a pattern. If she hadn't escaped, if James hadn't intervened, she would have disappeared just like Jennifer, leaving behind nothing but lies and cover stories. "There's something else," Patricia said, reaching into her purse again. "Something I should have given to the police years ago." She handed Eleanor a small digital recorder. "Before Jennifer disappeared, she gave this to me. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should make sure someone heard what was on it." Elena's hands trembled as she held the device. "You've had this for 6 years. I was too afraid to listen to it," Patricia admitted. "Too afraid of what I might hear, and too afraid of what it might mean for my son. But after what happened to you, I finally found the courage." Patricia showed Elena how to operate the recorder, and together they listened to Jennifer Walsh's voice speaking from beyond the void of her disappearance. "If someone is listening to this, it probably means Marcus has done something terrible to me," Jennifer's voice said, young and frightened, but determined. "I need someone to know the truth about what's been happening in our marriage." For the next 20 minutes, Elena listened to Jennifer describe a pattern of abuse that mirrored her own experience. The gradual isolation, the financial control, the psychological manipulation. But Jennifer's recording also contained specific details that could help build the case against Marcus. "Marcus has been meeting with men who run what they call acquisition services," Jennifer's voice continued. "They specialize in obtaining women for wealthy clients who want domestic servants they can control completely. Marcus has been negotiating my sale for 3 weeks now." Jennifer went on to describe the same warehouse on Dock Street, the same silver-haired man who had organized Elena's auction, even the same specific language about merchandise and transactions. "I'm going to try to escape," Jennifer concluded, "but if I can't, I need someone to know that I didn't leave willingly. I love my students, I love my life, and I would never abandon everything I've worked for. If I disappear, Marcus sold me." When the recording ended, Elena and Patricia sat in stunned silence. The evidence was devastating, not only for Marcus's current case, but potentially for reopening the investigation into Jennifer's disappearance. "You have to give this to Detective Chen," Eleanor said firmly. "Today," Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, I should have done it years ago. I've been living with this guilt for so long, knowing I could have saved you if I had just been brave enough to speak up." Elena studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and anguish there. "Mrs. Wells, what you did was wrong. Your silence allowed Marcus to hurt me, and it may have cost Jennifer her life, but you're doing the right thing now." They walked back to the courthouse together, where Detective Chen listened to Jennifer's recording with grim fascination. The implications were staggering. Marcus wasn't just a desperate man who had made a terrible decision. He was a serial predator who had systematically destroyed multiple women's lives. "This changes everything," Detective Chen said after hearing the full recording. "We can now charge Marcus with Jennifer's disappearance as well, and this establishes a clear pattern of behavior that will make conviction much more likely." Over the following days, the case exploded into national news. The story of the husband who had tried to auction his wife was shocking enough, but the revelation that he had successfully sold his first wife years earlier captivated the public imagination. Elena found herself thrust into the spotlight in ways she had never anticipated. James shielded her from most of the media attention, hiring a publicist to handle interview requests and employing additional security to keep reporters away from the house. But Elena decided to speak out about her experience, feeling that Jennifer's story and the stories of other women who might be suffering in silence needed to be told. Her first television interview was with a local news station, conducted in James's living room with Detective Chen present for support. Elena had been nervous about appearing on camera, but once she began speaking about her experience, the words flowed naturally. "I want other women to know that they're not alone," Elena said, looking directly into the camera. "I spent years thinking I was worthless, that I deserved the treatment I was receiving. I want them to know that no one deserves to be sold, to be treated as property, to live in fear of the person who's supposed to love them most." The response was overwhelming. Elena received hundreds of letters and emails from women sharing their own stories of abuse, thanking her for speaking out, asking for advice on how to escape dangerous situations. She realized that her experience, as traumatic as it had been, had given her a platform to help others. Working with Detective Chen and a local women's shelter, Elena began developing a program to help identify and assist potential trafficking victims. They created a network of service workers, house cleaners, nannies, home health aides, who were trained to recognize signs of abuse and provide resources to women in danger. "You'd be surprised how much we see," Elena explained to a group of trainees at the shelter. "We're in people's homes. We notice things that others miss: bruises, fearful behavior, controlling husbands who monitor every move their wives make. We can be the eyes and ears that help save lives." Meanwhile, Marcus's trial date was set for early spring. His lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor, buoyed by the strength of the evidence and the public attention on the case, refused to consider anything less than a full confession and maximum sentencing. Elena threw herself into her new work with James, finding purpose in managing his household and his business affairs. She discovered she had a talent for organization and communication, skills that Marcus had never allowed her to develop or recognize in herself. James treated her as a partner rather than an employee, asking for her input on business decisions and including her in social functions as his personal assistant rather than his domestic help. Elena slowly began to understand her own value, to see herself as the intelligent, capable woman that others had always seen in her. One evening in December, as Eleanor was preparing dinner in James's kitchen, she received a phone call that would change everything once again. Eleanor, the voice, was hesitant, female, speaking with a slight southwestern accent. "This is going to sound crazy, but I think I'm Jennifer Walsh." Elena nearly dropped the phone. "What did you say?" "I saw your interview on the news," the voice continued, stronger now. "When I heard you talk about Marcus, about what he did to you, I knew I had to call. I've been living in Arizona for the past 6 years under a different name. The man who bought me, he's dead now, and I'm free. But I need to tell you what really happened that night I disappeared." Elena sank into a chair, her mind reeling. Jennifer Walsh was alive. Marcus's first wife had somehow survived and escaped, and she was calling to share her story. "Where are you?" Elena asked. "Are you safe?" "I'm safe now," Jennifer replied. "But I need to come back to Oregon. I need to testify against Marcus, and I need to help make sure he never does this to another woman." Elena looked out the kitchen window at the life she had built for herself. The safe apartment, the meaningful work, the man who had saved her life and given her a chance to rebuild. Everything was about to change again, but this time, Elena wasn't afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next, and she wouldn't be facing it alone. "Tell me when you're coming," Elena said into the phone. "We have a lot of work to do." The Phoenix airport was crowded with holiday travelers when Elena spotted Jennifer Walsh emerging from the security checkpoint. Even after 6 years, Elena recognized her immediately from the photograph Patricia had shown her, though Jennifer looked older now, her blonde hair shorter and her blue eyes carrying shadows that spoke of unimaginable experiences. Elena approached, cautiously, unsure of the protocol for meeting someone who had survived what should have been a fate worse than death. But Jennifer smiled when she saw her, and Elena felt an instant connection to this woman who understood her trauma in ways no one else could. "I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to come back," Jennifer said as they embraced awkwardly in the middle of the busy terminal. "But when I saw your interview, when I heard you talking about finding your voice, I knew I had to try." They drove back to Millbrook in James's car, with Elena behind the wheel and Jennifer staring out at the Oregon landscape she hadn't seen in 6 years. Elena had offered to put Jennifer up in a hotel, but Jennifer had insisted on seeing the apartment above James's garage. She wanted to understand how Elena had rebuilt her life after escaping Marcus's trap. "It's beautiful," Jennifer said as they toured the small space that had become Elena's sanctuary. "You've really created a home here." "It's the first place I've ever lived where I felt truly safe," Eleanor admitted. "James has given me more than just a job and a place to live. He's given me back my sense of worth." Jennifer nodded, understanding the significance of those words in ways that no one who hadn't lived through similar trauma could comprehend. That evening, they sat in Elena's kitchen while Jennifer told her story. Not the sanitized version she would eventually give in court, but the raw, unfiltered truth of what had happened after Marcus sold her to a man named Calvin Reeves in Las Vegas. Calvin owned what he called an executive domestic service, Jennifer began, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she held her coffee mug. Wealthy men would pay him enormous sums to provide them with live-in housekeepers who were essentially slaves, women who had no legal identity, no way to escape, no one who would look for them. Elena listened in horror as Jennifer described the compound outside Las Vegas where Calvin kept his employees, a dozen women of various ages, all of whom had been sold by husbands, fathers, or boyfriends who needed money more than they valued human dignity. "The first 2 years were the worst," Jennifer continued. "Calvin was methodical about breaking down our spirits. He would separate women who became friends, punish anyone who showed defiance, and constantly remind us that we were legally dead, that even if we escaped, we had no way to prove who we were or get help." Jennifer had been assigned to a technology executive named Robert Chen, who lived in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills and entertained frequently. Her job was to maintain his house, prepare meals for his guests, and remain completely invisible while doing so. "Robert wasn't physically abusive," Jennifer said, "but the psychological torture was constant. I had to pretend I didn't speak English. When his friends were around, I had to act grateful for scraps of food and a mattress in the basement. I had to watch him live this incredible life of luxury while I worked 18 hours a day for nothing." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the life that could have been hers if James hadn't intervened. "How did you survive it? How did you keep from giving up completely?" Jennifer smiled sadly. "I almost did give up many times. But I kept thinking about my students, the third graders I had been teaching when I disappeared. I wondered if they remembered me, if they asked their new teacher what had happened to Miss Walsh. That thought kept me alive." The breakthrough had come in Jennifer's 4th year of captivity, when Robert Chen was arrested for tax evasion and his assets were seized by the federal government. In the chaos that followed, Jennifer had been transferred to a different client, but during the transport, she had managed to escape. "I was terrified they would find me," Jennifer said. "Calvin had always told us that he had connections everywhere, that we could never truly escape, so I created a new identity, Rebecca Martinez. I got fake documents, moved to a small town in Arizona, and worked as a waitress in a diner where nobody asked questions. For 2 years, Jennifer had lived in constant fear that Calvin or his associates would track her down. But then she learned from a news report that Calvin Reeves had died of a heart attack, and his organization had been dismantled by federal investigators. That's when I finally felt safe enough to start thinking about coming forward, Jennifer explained. But I didn't know how to prove who I was, or whether anyone would believe my story. Then I saw your interview and I knew I had to try. Detective Chen arrived the next morning to take Jennifer's formal statement, and Elena was struck by the professionalism with which the detective handled what must have been an extraordinary situation. Jennifer's testimony would not only strengthen the case against Marcus, but could potentially help law enforcement investigate the broader trafficking network that had destroyed so many lives. Ms. Walsh, Detective Chen said gently, I need to ask you some difficult questions about the night you disappeared. Are you prepared for that? Jennifer nodded, her jaw set with determination. I've been preparing for this conversation for 6 years. Over the next 3 hours, Jennifer provided a detailed account of her final night with Marcus. Unlike Elena's experience, Jennifer had known what was coming. She had overheard Marcus's phone conversations with the traffickers and had tried desperately to find a way to escape. I called the police that night, Jennifer said, but Marcus had convinced them that I was having a mental breakdown, that I was making wild accusations because our marriage was falling apart. When the officers came to our house, Marcus was so calm and reasonable that they believed him instead of me. Elena felt a chill of recognition. Marcus's ability to manipulate authority figures, to present himself as the rational party while painting his victims as unstable, was a skill he had clearly refined over many years. I tried to run away twice that week, Jennifer continued. But Marcus caught me both times. He locked me in our bedroom for 3 days, only letting me out under supervision. By the time Saturday night came, I was too weak and demoralized to fight anymore. Jennifer's account of the actual transaction was chillingly similar to what Elena had experienced, with one crucial difference. Jennifer's auction had been successful. She had been sold to Calvin Reeves for $18,000. And Marcus had disappeared with the money before anyone realized she was missing. The worst part, Jennifer said quietly, was that Marcus kissed me goodbye. After he had sold me, after he had destroyed my life for money, he actually kissed my forehead and told me he was sorry it had to be this way. Elena reached across the table and squeezed Jennifer's hand, understanding the particular cruelty of that gesture in ways that Detective Chen, despite her compassion, could not. The formal process of restoring Jennifer's legal identity proved to be surprisingly complex. She had been declared dead in absentia 3 years earlier, and reversing that declaration required extensive documentation and legal procedures. James, who had quietly been paying for Elena's legal representation, extended his support to Jennifer, as well hiring an attorney who specialized in cases involving trafficking victims. Why are you helping us? Jennifer asked James one evening as they sat in his living room going over legal documents. You don't know me, and you barely knew Elena before all this started. James was quiet for a moment, and Elena could see him struggling with how much of his personal story to share. Finally, he spoke about Catherine, his first wife, and his failure to protect her from her abusive ex-husband. I can't bring Catherine back, James said simply, but I can try to make sure that other women have the chance to rebuild their lives. After surviving the unthinkable, as Jennifer's legal status was slowly restored, Elena helped her navigate the practical challenges of returning to a world that had moved on without her. Jennifer's parents had died while she was in captivity. Her teaching certification had expired, and her former colleagues had long since moved on to other schools and other lives. It's like being a ghost, Jennifer said one afternoon as they sorted through paperwork at Elena's kitchen table. Technically, I'm alive, but the life I had before is completely gone. Elena understood this feeling intimately. Her own marriage was over, her old life destroyed, her sense of identity fundamentally altered by trauma. But she had also discovered something unexpected in the process of rebuilding. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. "You're not the same person you were 6 years ago," Elena told Jennifer, "but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe the woman you're becoming is someone who can't be broken or sold or silenced." Jennifer smiled for the first time since arriving in Oregon. "I keep thinking about my students. They would be in high school now. I wonder if any of them still remember Miss Walsh and what they would think of the woman I've become." As Marcus's trial approached, both women threw themselves into preparation, working with the prosecution team to ensure that every detail of their testimonies was accurate and compelling. The case had attracted national attention, with legal experts calling it one of the most significant human trafficking prosecutions in recent memory. The media attention was overwhelming at times, but Elena had learned to use it strategically, giving interviews that raised awareness about domestic trafficking while protecting the most intimate details of her and Jennifer's experiences. One interview in particular stood out, a prime time special on a major network where Elena and Jennifer appeared together for the first time publicly. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Sarah Williams, handled their stories with sensitivity while still asking the hard questions that viewers wanted answered. "What would you say to other women who might be in situations similar to what you experienced?" Williams asked. Elena and Jennifer exchanged glances, having discussed this question many times. "I would tell them that they are not alone," Elena said, "and that their lives have value beyond what anyone else assigns to them. And I would tell them that survival is possible," Jennifer added, "even when you think you've lost everything. Even when you think no one will believe you or help you, there is always a way forward." The interview aired on a Sunday night and was watched by more than 12 million people. The response was extraordinary. The National Human Trafficking Hotline reported a 400% increase in calls the following week, and women's shelters across the country saw a surge in requests for help. Elena realized that their story had become larger than just seeking justice for what Marcus had done to them. It had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about domestic trafficking, about the invisible women who disappear from society without anyone noticing or caring enough to look for them. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Elena received another unexpected phone call. This time, it was from a woman named Maria Santos in California, who had seen the news coverage and believed she had information about another one of Marcus's victims. "I think my sister Rosa was sold by her husband," Maria said, her voice breaking with emotion. "She disappeared 2 years ago, and her husband told everyone she had run away to Mexico. But Rosa would never have left her children behind." Elena felt her heart sink as she realized that Marcus's crimes might be even more extensive than anyone had imagined. She gave Maria Detective Chen's contact information and promised to help however she could. That night, as Elena lay in bed thinking about Rosa Santos and how many other women might have suffered because of Marcus's greed, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trial would hopefully bring justice for what he had done to her and Jennifer, but their real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, she would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as a survivor with a voice. She would look Marcus in the eye and tell the world exactly what he had tried to do to her, and she would make sure that every woman still trapped in situations like theirs knew that escape was possible. Jennifer was sleeping in the guest room downstairs, preparing for her own testimony. Together, they represented hope for women who had been told they were worthless, who had been treated as commodities to be bought and sold. Marcus had tried to destroy them both, but he had failed, and now they were going to make sure he could never hurt anyone else again. The trial would begin in 3 days, and Elena was ready. The courthouse steps were lined with news vans and protesters when Elena and Jennifer arrived for the first day of Marcus's trial. Signs reading "Justice for Jennifer" and "End Human Trafficking" bobbed above a crowd of supporters who had traveled from across the country to witness what many legal experts were calling a landmark case. Elena felt her stomach clench as she walked through the gauntlet of reporters shouting questions and camera flashes exploding around them. Despite months of preparation, the reality of facing Marcus in open court felt overwhelming. Jennifer walked beside her, outwardly calm, but gripping Elena's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. Inside the courthouse, District Attorney Margaret Foster briefed them one final time before proceedings began. Foster was a seasoned prosecutor in her 50s who had built her career on violent crimes against women, and she had taken Marcus's case personally. "Remember," Foster said, looking at both women intently, "Marcus's defense attorney is going to try to paint you as willing participants who are now seeking revenge. He's going to suggest that you both left your marriages voluntarily and are fabricating these stories for attention or money." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest. How can they say that when we have Jennifer's recording from 6 years ago? Defense attorney Kevin Walsh, no relation to Jennifer, is very good at creating doubt, Foster explained. He's going to argue that the recording could have been made recently or that it was taken out of context. He's going to claim that both of your marriages were troubled and that you're using the trafficking story to avoid responsibility for abandoning your husbands. Jennifer spoke for the first time that morning, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Let him try. I have scars that tell the truth about what happened to me." As they entered the courtroom, Eleanor caught sight of Marcus for the first time since his arraignment 3 months earlier. He had lost weight in jail and looked older, his hair now showing grey at the temples. When his eyes met hers across the room, Elena felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no residual affection. He was simply a stranger who had once had power over her life and no longer did. The jury selection had taken 2 weeks, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for biases about domestic violence and human trafficking. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 26 to 63, representing a cross-section of the community that would decide Marcus's fate. Defense attorney Walsh rose for his opening statement, and Eleanor immediately understood why Foster had warned them about him. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and a voice that commanded attention. More dangerously, he projected an air of compassionate reasonableness that could easily sway a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh began, "this case is not about human trafficking. This case is about a marriage that went wrong, about 2 people who made mistakes, and about a woman who has fabricated an elaborate story to avoid taking responsibility for her own choices." Eleanor felt her blood pressure spike as Walsh painted a picture of her as a manipulative woman who had abandoned her marriage and was now seeking revenge and attention through false accusations. "Elena Rodriguez was unhappy in her marriage," Walsh continued, pacing before the jury box. She felt trapped, unfulfilled, perhaps even resentful of her husband's financial struggles. When an opportunity arose to escape that marriage and start a new life with a wealthy benefactor, Mr. James Morrison, she took it. But rather than simply filing for divorce like a reasonable person, she concocted this elaborate trafficking story to make herself appear as a victim rather than a woman who abandoned her vows. The defense attorney was even more brutal in his characterization of Jennifer Walsh. He suggested that she had voluntarily entered into an alternative lifestyle arrangement in Nevada, and that her disappearance had been carefully planned to avoid the stigma of divorce in her conservative community. Jennifer Walsh was an unhappy woman in an unhappy marriage, he said. She made choices, difficult choices, perhaps unconventional choices, but they were her choices, Now, 6 years later, she has emerged with a story designed to paint her as a victim rather than a woman who chose to leave her old life behind. Elena watched the jury's faces as Walsh spoke, trying to gauge their reactions. Several jurors were taking notes, their expressions neutral but attentive. She prayed that Foster's evidence would be strong enough to counter the defense's narrative. When Foster rose for the prosecution's opening statement, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Where Walsh had been smooth and reasonable, Foster was passionate and direct, speaking with the conviction of someone who had seen too many women destroyed by men like Marcus. "Members of the jury," Foster began, "what you're going to hear in this courtroom over the next week is not a story about marriage troubles or unconventional lifestyle choices. You're going to hear about a predator who systematically destroyed the lives of at least 2 women and possibly many more for money." Foster outlined the prosecution's evidence methodically, Jennifer's 6-year-old recording describing Marcus's plan to sell her, the testimony of the undercover officer who had infiltrated the trafficking ring, the recorded phone conversations between Marcus and his trafficker contacts, and the financial records showing money changing hands. "The defense wants you to believe that this is all an elaborate fabrication," Foster said, making eye contact with each juror in turn. "But fabrications don't leave paper trails. Fabrications don't involve multiple independent witnesses. And fabrications certainly don't span 6 years and involve women who had never met each other until this case brought them together." The first witness was Detective Chen, who methodically walked the jury through the investigation that had led to Marcus's arrest. She described the anonymous tip that had led police to the warehouse, the evidence they had found at the scene, and the network of traffickers who had been arrested in the raid. "In your professional opinion," Foster asked, "was Mrs. Rodriguez in immediate danger on the night of her husband's arrest?" "Absolutely," Detective Chen replied without hesitation. "Based on our investigation of this trafficking ring, women who were sold into their network typically disappeared permanently. If we hadn't intervened that night, I believe Elena Rodriguez would never have been seen again." The defense's cross-examination of Detective Chen was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. Walsh tried to suggest that the police had been manipulated by Elena's false story, but Detective Chen's professionalism and the weight of the physical evidence made his argument seem desperate. The second day of testimony focused on the financial aspects of the case. A forensic accountant detailed the money trail that connected Marcus to the trafficking organization, showing payments he had received as a down payment for Elena's sale, and similar payments he had received 6 years earlier. Around the time of Jennifer's disappearance, Mr. Rodriguez received $5,000 from Calvin Reeves on November 15th, 6 years ago, the accountant testified. This was exactly 1 week before Jennifer Rodriguez was reported missing. Elena watched Marcus's face as the financial evidence was presented, and for the first time she saw cracks in his composure. He conferred frantically with his attorney, his face growing pale as the prosecution built their case that he had been trafficking women for years. The most powerful testimony came on the 3rd day, when Jennifer took the stand. Elena held her breath as her friend, for that's what Jennifer had become, walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity. Foster's direct examination of Jennifer was masterful, allowing her to tell her story in her own words while providing the legal framework necessary for conviction. Jennifer described her marriage to Marcus, the gradual escalation of his controlling behavior, and the terrifying night when she realized he was planning to sell her. "I tried to call the police," Jennifer testified, "but Marcus had already told them I was having a mental breakdown. When the officers came to our house, they saw me as a hysterical woman making wild accusations against my reasonable, concerned husband." Jennifer's voice remained steady as she described the auction, her sale to Calvin Reeves, and the 6 years of forced labor that followed. Several jurors were openly weeping as she recounted the worst aspects of her captivity. "What gave you the strength to survive?" Foster asked gently. "I kept thinking about the children I used to teach," Jennifer replied. "Third graders who depended on me, who trusted me. I knew that if I gave up, if I let them break me completely, then Marcus would have won. He would have succeeded in erasing Jennifer Walsh from the world." The defense's cross-examination of Jennifer was where Walsh revealed his true character. He attacked her credibility mercilessly, suggesting that her years in Arizona under a false identity proved she was comfortable with deception. "Isn't it true, Ms. Walsh, that you have been living under a false identity for the past 2 years?" Walsh demanded. "I was surviving," Jennifer replied firmly. "I was trying to stay alive after escaping from people who had purchased me like livestock." "But you admit you falsified documents, assumed someone else's identity, committed identity fraud," Foster objected, but the damage was done. Walsh was trying to paint Jennifer as a criminal rather than a victim. Elena's testimony came on the 4th day, and she had prepared for this moment for months. As she walked to the witness stand, she made eye contact with Marcus for the first time during the trial. He looked away immediately, unable to meet her gaze. Elena told her story with quiet strength, describing her marriage to Marcus, the gradual escalation of his controlling behavior, and the night she overheard him planning her sale. She explained how James Morrison had noticed her distress and ultimately saved her life. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Foster asked, "why didn't you simply leave your husband if you were unhappy in your marriage?" "Because I didn't believe I had anywhere to go," Elena replied honestly. "Marcus had convinced me that I was worthless, that no one else would ever care about me. He made me believe that I was lucky to have him, even when he was hurting me." When Walsh cross-examined Elena, he focused on her relationship with James Morrison, trying to suggest that she had fabricated the trafficking story to justify leaving her marriage for a wealthier man. "Isn't it true that you had developed romantic feelings for Mr. Morrison before your husband's arrest?" Walsh asked. Elena felt her cheeks flush, but she answered honestly, "I was grateful to Mr. Morrison for helping me, but our relationship has always been professional. He saved my life and gave me a chance to rebuild it. That's all." "But he's provided you with housing, employment, financial support. Quite generous. For someone who's just being professional, wouldn't you say?" "He's helped me because he's a good person who believes in helping trafficking victims," Elena replied firmly. "Not because of any romantic relationship." The prosecution's final witness was the undercover officer who had infiltrated the trafficking ring. Officer Maria Gonzalez had spent 6 months working her way into the organization, posing as a woman seeking to sell her sister. Her testimony provided crucial context about how the trafficking ring operated and confirmed that Elena's case fit their standard pattern. "In your undercover capacity," Foster asked, "did you witness other auctions similar to the one planned for Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Yes," Officer Gonzalez replied. "I witnessed 3 auctions during my investigation. The format was always the same. Women were brought to the warehouse under false pretenses, then sold to the highest bidder. Most of the women had been sold by husbands or boyfriends who needed money. What typically happened to these women after they were sold? They disappeared into a network of forced labor operations across the western United States. Some were forced into domestic servitude, others into agricultural work, some into the sex trade. Very few were ever seen again. The defense called only 2 witnesses, a psychiatrist who testified that both Elena and Jennifer showed signs of false memory syndrome, and a private investigator who claimed to have evidence that Jennifer had voluntarily assumed her false identity. In Arizona, neither witness was particularly convincing, and Foster's cross-examinations effectively dismantled their credibility. Marcus himself chose not to testify, a decision that spoke volumes about the weakness of his defense. Closing arguments began on the sixth day of trial. Walsh made one final attempt to paint Elena and Jennifer as women who had fabricated their stories for personal gain, but his arguments felt desperate and hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence against Marcus. Foster's closing argument was devastating. She systematically destroyed every aspect of the defense's case, walking the jury through the evidence that proved Marcus had sold both women into trafficking rings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Foster concluded, "Marcus Rodriguez is not a man who made a mistake or whose marriage simply fell apart. He is a predator who viewed his wives as commodities to be sold when they became inconvenient or when he needed money. He destroyed Jennifer Walsh's life 6 years ago, and he attempted to do the same thing to Elena Rodriguez. Your verdict will determine whether he ever gets the chance to do it again." The jury deliberated for 14 hours, over 2 days. Elena and Jennifer waited in a conference room with Foster and Detective Chen, barely speaking as the minutes crawled. Elena found herself thinking about all the women who might still be trapped in situations like the one she and Jennifer had escaped. This verdict would send a message about how seriously society took crimes against women who were supposed to be protected by the men who claimed to love them. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, Elena felt her heart hammering as they filed back into the courtroom. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who had taken copious notes throughout the trial, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of human trafficking in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." Elena felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the foreman continued through the list of charges. Guilty of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, guilty of attempted kidnapping, guilty of racketeering, guilty on all counts. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Elena could see his hand shaking as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she addressed Marcus directly before adjourning the court. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice cold with contempt, "you have been convicted of some of the most serious crimes against women that this court has ever seen. You will remain in custody pending sentencing, and I can assure you that when that day comes, you will face the full weight of justice for what you have done." As the courtroom erupted in applause and Elena was surrounded by supporters and reporters, she felt a profound sense of closure. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison, and he would never hurt another woman. But more importantly, Elena had found her voice and her strength. She was no longer the frightened woman who had been sold like livestock. She was Elena Rodriguez, survivor and advocate, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure that other women knew they were worth more than any price their abusers might place on them. The nightmare was finally over. Justice had been served. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing to life in prison without parole, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Oregon, delivering the keynote address at the National Conference on Human Trafficking. Prevention. The woman who had once cleaned houses in silence, invisible to those around her, now commanded the attention of legislators, law enforcement officials, and advocacy groups from across the nation. "When I was married to Marcus Rodriguez," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I believed I was worthless. I believed that my value as a human being was determined by how well I served others, how little space I took up in the world, how quietly I suffered. Today, I stand before you as proof that our worth cannot be measured in dollars, cannot be diminished by abuse, and cannot be destroyed by those who would treat us as property." The thunderous applause that followed felt surreal to Elena, who still sometimes caught glimpses of herself in mirrors, the frightened woman who had scrubbed floors while planning her escape from a husband who planned to sell her. But that woman had been transformed by fire into someone stronger, someone whose voice could not be silenced. In the months following the trial, Elena's life had taken directions she never could have imagined. The Elena Rodriguez Foundation, established. With an anonymous donation that Elena suspected came from James Morrison, had already helped rescue 17 women from trafficking situations. Working with law enforcement agencies across 12 states, Elena had developed protocols for identifying potential victims among domestic workers, nannies, and other service providers who often remained invisible to society. Jennifer Walsh had become Elena's closest collaborator in this work. After legally reclaiming her identity and re-establishing her teaching credentials, Jennifer had chosen not to return to the classroom. Instead, she had become the Foundation's Director of Survivor Services, working directly with women who had escaped trafficking situations and needed help rebuilding their lives. The hardest part isn't the physical recovery, Jennifer often told new clients. It's learning to believe that you deserve better, that you have value beyond what others assign to you. Their work had uncovered a sobering reality. Marcus's case was far from unique. The investigation that followed his conviction had revealed a network of domestic trafficking that spanned the entire western United States, involving dozens of men who had sold wives, daughters, and girlfriends to traffickers for amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000. Detective Chen, who had been promoted to head the state's new human trafficking task force, regularly consulted with Elena and Jennifer on cases that seemed to follow the same pattern Marcus had used. The three women had formed an unlikely but effective partnership, combining law enforcement expertise with survivor insight to identify and rescue women who might otherwise have disappeared without a trace. One such case had brought them to Sacramento 3 weeks earlier, where they had worked with local police to rescue a woman named Carmen Delgado, whose common-law husband had attempted to sell her to pay off gambling debts. Carmen was now staying at a safe house run by the Foundation, slowly learning to trust again after years of abuse. The traffickers are getting more sophisticated, Detective Chen had explained during their most recent strategy meeting. They're using social media to find vulnerable women, creating fake online relationships and convincing victims to travel willingly to locations where they're then sold. It's becoming harder to distinguish between willing participants and coercion victims. Elena had nodded grimly, understanding how easily she might have fallen for such tactics during her darkest days with Marcus. The line between emotional manipulation and outright force was often blurrier than people realized. As Elena continued her keynote address, she caught sight of James Morrison in the audience. He attended most of her speaking engagements when his business schedule permitted, offering quiet support without seeking recognition for the role he had played in her rescue and recovery. Their relationship had evolved over the past year into something that defied easy categorization. He was more than an employer, but not quite a romantic partner, more than a friend, but not family. He was simply James, the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The question I'm asked most frequently, Elena told the audience, is how I found the courage to rebuild my life after such trauma. The answer is that courage isn't something you find. It's something you build, one decision at a time. Every day I choose to believe that my voice matters, that my story can help someone else, that the woman I'm becoming is stronger than the woman I was forced to be. After her speech, Elena was approached by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a researcher from Johns Hopkins University who was conducting a longitudinal study on trafficking survivors. Dr. Martinez had been following Elena's case since the trial, documenting her recovery process as part of a broader research project aimed at improving support services for survivors. Elena, your progress has been remarkable, Dr. Martinez said as they walked through the university's campus after the conference. Most trafficking survivors struggle with PTSD symptoms for years, if not decades. Your ability to not only recover, But to become an advocate for others is truly extraordinary. Elena considered this assessment carefully. She had indeed worked hard to overcome the trauma of her experience, attending therapy sessions twice a week and participating in support groups for domestic violence survivors. But she had also discovered that helping other women gave her a sense of purpose that traditional therapy alone couldn't provide. "I think revenge is the wrong word," Elena said thoughtfully, "but there's definitely something powerful about transforming the worst experience of your life into a tool for helping others. Marcus tried to destroy me, and instead, he created someone who will spend the rest of her life making sure men like him face consequences for their actions." Dr. Martinez made notes on her tablet as they talked. "Have you had any contact with Marcus since his sentencing?" Elena shook her head. "He's written me several letters from prison, but I've never opened them. My attorney screens my mail and handles any legal correspondence. I have no interest in anything Marcus Rodriguez has to say." What Elena didn't mention was that she knew the content of those letters because her attorney had summarized them for her. Marcus's early letters had been filled with apologies and explanations, attempting to justify his actions as desperate measures taken by a man who felt trapped by poverty and circumstance. More recent letters had turned angry, blaming Elena for destroying his life and claiming that she had seduced James Morrison as part of an elaborate plan to frame him. "He still doesn't understand that what he did was wrong," Elena had told her, a therapist during their last session. "In his mind, he's the victim in this situation. That tells me everything I need to know about the man I was married to." The conference had also brought unexpected news. Maria Santos, the woman who had called Elena about her missing sister Rosa, had flown in from California to update them on the investigation into Rosa's disappearance. Working with Detective Chen and the FBI, Maria had uncovered evidence that Rosa's husband had indeed sold her to a trafficking ring operating out of Nevada, the same network that had purchased Jennifer 6 years earlier. "We think Rosa is still alive," Maria told Elena and Jennifer during a private meeting at the hotel. FBI agents raided a compound outside Reno last month and found evidence that she had been held there as recently as 6 months ago. They're following leads that suggest she may have been moved to a location in Arizona. Elena felt her heart race with hope and anxiety. Rosa Santos had been missing for over 2 years. If she was still alive, she would have endured unimaginable trauma. But she would also represent another survivor whose story could help law enforcement understand and dismantle these trafficking networks. "What can we do to help?" Jennifer asked immediately. "The FBI wants to know if either of you would be willing to participate in outreach efforts if they locate Rosa," Maria explained. "Sometimes trafficking survivors respond better to other survivors than to law enforcement officials." Elena and Jennifer agreed without hesitation. They had both experienced the isolation and disorientation that came with being rescued from trafficking situations, and they understood how crucial it was to have someone who truly comprehend what you had endured. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone buzzing with an urgent text message from James. "Turn on Channel 7 News immediately. There's been a development in Marcus's case." Elena excused herself and rushed to her hotel room, where she found the local news covering a breaking story. A reporter stood outside the Oregon State Penitentiary explaining that Marcus Rodriguez had been found dead in his cell that morning, apparently the victim of an attack by fellow inmates. Elena sank onto the hotel bed, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. She had imagined Marcus serving his life sentence, growing old in prison while she built her new life in freedom. She had never wished him dead, but she felt no grief at the news of his passing either. Her phone rang. Almost immediately, James calling to check on her reaction to the news. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I think so," Elena replied honestly. "It's strange. I thought I would feel something. Relief, maybe, or closure. But mostly I just feel empty. Like this chapter of my life is finally unfinished. Do you want me to come to Sacramento?" James offered. "I can be on a plane in 2 hours." Elena smiled at his immediate willingness to support her. "No, I'm fine. Jennifer is here, and we have meetings with the FBI tomorrow about Rosa's case. I'd rather focus on helping other women than dwelling on Marcus's fate." That evening, Elena and Jennifer sat in Elena's hotel room, ordering room service and processing the day's events. The news of Marcus's death had been covered extensively by national media, with most reports framing it as a fitting end for a man who had destroyed so many lives. "Do you think we're supposed to feel guilty that we're not mourning him?" Jennifer asked, picking at her salad. Elena considered the question seriously. "I think we're supposed to feel whatever we actually feel, not what other people think we should feel. Marcus made choices that led to his imprisonment and ultimately to his death. We didn't cause any of that. We just refused to let him destroy us." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Elena opened it to find Dr. Martinez, who had heard about Marcus's death and wanted to check on both women. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Dr. Martinez said. "I know this must be a difficult day for both of you." They invited her in, and Dr. Martinez explained that the death of an abuser often triggered complicated emotions in survivors, even when the relationship had been entirely destructive. "Some survivors feel guilty for not grieving," she said, "while others worry that they're supposed to feel relief or satisfaction. The truth is that there's no right way to react when someone who hurt you dies." Elena found this perspective helpful. She had been wondering if her lack of strong emotion meant she was somehow deficient in empathy or human feeling. Dr. Martinez's words reassured her that her reaction was normal and healthy. The next morning brought a new challenge. Elena woke to find dozens of interview requests from media outlets wanting her reaction to Marcus's death. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, and the hotel lobby was packed with news crews hoping to catch her on her way to breakfast. "This is exactly why I hate publicity," Jennifer muttered as they watched the chaos from Elena's hotel room window. "They want to turn Marcus's death into entertainment." Elena agreed, but she also recognized an opportunity. What if we use this attention to talk about the women who are still missing? What if we make this about Rosa Santos and all the other victims instead of about Marcus? They called a press conference for that afternoon with Eleanor and Jennifer, appearing together to address Marcus's death and pivot the conversation toward the ongoing fight against domestic trafficking. "Marcus Rodriguez is dead," Elena told the assembled reporters, "but the networks he participated in are still operating. Right now, there are women being held against their will, women whose families think they ran away or simply disappeared. Our focus should be on finding those women and bringing them home." Jennifer spoke about the FBI's search for Rosa Santos, providing details about the case that might help generate tips from the public. They announced a reward fund for information leading to Rosa's rescue, funded by donations to the Elena Rodriguez Foundation. The press conference was a success, generating national coverage that focused on ongoing trafficking cases rather than simply rehashing Marcus's crimes. Within hours of the broadcast, the FBI had received dozens of tips about Rosa's possible whereabouts. 3 days later, Elena received the call she had been hoping for. Detective Chen's voice was filled with excitement as she delivered the news. "We found her. Rosa Santos is alive, and she's free." Rosa had been rescued from a farm labor camp in Arizona. where she had been forced to work in the fields for 16 hours a day, while living in a converted shipping container with 5 other women. She was malnourished and traumatized, but alive. And she was asking to speak with Elena and Jennifer. Elena felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she absorbed the news. Another woman had been saved, another family reunited, another victory against the forces that sought to treat human beings as commodities. Marcus Rodriguez was dead, but his victims were alive and fighting back. And Elena Rodriguez, the woman he had tried to sell like livestock, was leading the charge to make sure that no other woman would suffer as she had suffered. The work was far from over, but progress was being made, one rescued woman at a time. 2 years later, Elena stood in the Arizona hospital room where Rosa Santos was recovering from her rescue. The woman before her bore little resemblance to the vibrant mother of 3 that Elena had seen in family photographs. Rosa's hair had been chopped short and bleached by harsh chemicals. Her hands were scarred from years of forced labor, and her eyes held the haunted look that Elena recognized from her own mirror in the months following her escape. But Rosa was alive, and she was free, and that was everything. "Maria showed me your picture," Rosa said quietly in Spanish, her voice hoarse from disuse. "She told me you understood what happened to me." Elena pulled a chair close to Rosa's bedside and sat down. "I understand more than I wish I did," she replied, also in Spanish. "But I also understand that surviving makes us stronger than they ever intended us to be." Rosa's rescue had taken 8 months of painstaking investigation. The Arizona labor camp, where she had been held, operated under the cover of a legitimate agricultural business, using a sophisticated system of false documentation and intimidation to keep their victims compliant. Rosa had been one of 37 women rescued in the raid, representing victims from across Latin America who had been trafficked into the United States under false promises of legitimate employment. "My children," Rosa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Are they safe? Do they remember me?" Elena smiled and squeezed Rosa's hand gently. "They're here in Phoenix, with your sister Maria. They've been waiting for you every day since you disappeared. Your youngest daughter Carmen drew you a picture of your family standing together again. Would you like to see it?" Elena pulled out her phone and showed Rosa a photo of the drawing, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, with the words, "Welcome home, Mama," written in crayon across the top. Rosa sobbed as she looked at the image, overcome with the reality that her nightmare was finally over. The reunion between Rosa and her children later that day was one of the most emotional moments Elena had ever witnessed. 9-year-old Carmen, who had been only 7 when her mother disappeared, approached tentatively at first, as if she couldn't quite believe Rosa was real. But when Rosa opened her arms, all 3 children rushed forward, and the family collapsed. Together in tears and laughter, Elena stepped back to give the family privacy, but Rosa caught her hand as she started to leave. "Thank you," Rosa said simply. "Maria told me what you did, how you spoke out even when it was dangerous. You saved my life by saving your own." Elena felt the truth of those words settle in her chest. Her decision to testify against Marcus, to build the foundation, to dedicate her life to helping other survivors, all of it had led to this moment when another family was made whole again. 3 weeks later, Elena was back in Millbrook for the dedication of the new regional headquarters of the Elena Rodriguez Foundation. The building, a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, would serve as a safe house, training center, and coordination hub for anti-trafficking efforts across the Pacific Northwest. James Morrison had purchased and renovated the building, though he had insisted that his name appear nowhere on the dedication plaque. As Elena toured the facility with its secure dormitories for survivors, therapy rooms, legal aid offices, and training facilities for law enforcement, she marveled at how far she had come from the woman who used to clean houses in silence. "Old Cottage is just 3 blocks from here," James mentioned, as they walked through the main lobby, where portraits of rescued survivors lined the walls. Elena nodded. She had driven past the cottage earlier that day, noting that new tenants had planted flowers in the yard where she used to sit and dream of escape. The sight had filled her with a strange sense of completion. That place of fear and desperation had been transformed into just another house where other people were building their own stories. During the dedication ceremony, Elena was joined on stage by Jennifer, Detective Chen, and Dr. Martinez, who had documented Elena's journey for her research on survivor recovery. Also present was Congresswoman Sarah Walsh, no relation to Marcus's defense attorney, who had sponsored federal legislation expanding resources for trafficking survivors. The Elena Rodriguez Act, Congresswoman Walsh announced, will provide federal funding for survivor-led organizations and establish new protocols for identifying domestic trafficking victims. This legislation exists because one woman refused to let her voice be silenced. Elena felt overwhelmed by the recognition, but also humbled by the responsibility it represented. The legislation would help countless women, but it also meant that her story was now permanently woven into the legal framework designed to protect others. The most meaningful moment of the day came when Rosa Santos took the microphone, speaking publicly for the first time since her rescue. She was still recovering physically and emotionally, but she had insisted on attending the dedication. "2 years ago, I was sold by my husband like a piece of furniture," Rosa said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I thought I would die in that place, forgotten by the world. But Elena Rodriguez proved that we are not disposable. We are not merchandise. We are human beings with voices that matter." As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled in the Foundation's new training center, Elena found herself in conversation with a young woman named Amy Chen, Detective Chen's daughter, who was studying social work at Portland State University. "I want to work for the Foundation after I graduate," Amy said earnestly. "My mom has told me so much about your work. I want to help other women the way you helped Rosa." Elena smiled, recognizing the passion in Amy's eyes that reminded her of her own journey from victim to advocate. "We'll always need people who understand that this work isn't just about rescue. It's about helping women rebuild their sense of worth and purpose." Later that evening, Elena and James sat on the porch of his house, their house, really, since Elena had never moved out of the garage apartment that had become her sanctuary. Their relationship had evolved into something unique and uncompromising, built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep understanding of each other's histories. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Everything you've been through, all the attention, the responsibility of the Foundation?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I regret that it happened to me and to Jennifer and to Rosa and to all the women we haven't been able to save yet. But I don't regret where it led me. I don't regret becoming someone who fights back." James nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. "Catherine would have liked you," he said quietly, referring to his first wife who had died at the hands of her abusive ex-husband. "She would have been proud of what you've built from such trauma." As darkness settled over Millbrook, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a woman who believed she was worthless, who cleaned houses in silence while her husband planned to sell her like livestock. Tonight, she was Elena Rodriguez, founder of a national organization that had rescued over 100 women from trafficking situations. Marcus Rodriguez had tried to auction her, believing her value could be measured in dollars. But a stranger, James Morrison, had recognized her true worth and refused to let her be sold into slavery. More importantly, Elena had learned to see that worth in herself. Tomorrow, she will continue the work of helping other women discover their own voices, their own strength, their own unshakable value as human beings. She would testify before Congress about the need for stronger anti-trafficking laws. She would train law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of domestic trafficking. She would hold the hands of newly rescued women and tell them what someone had once told her, that survival was possible, that healing was possible, that they were worth more than anyone who had hurt them could ever understand. The woman who had once been marked for sale had become priceless in the truest sense of the word. Elena Rodriguez belonged to no one but herself, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure other women learned that same liberating truth. Her story had become larger than her trauma, more powerful than her fear, and more enduring than the man who had tried to destroy her. She was free, she was whole, and she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.